So that we were in a rather precarious situation. Then came, that was in October, so by that time the Hungarian German forces, but mostly German forces in Budapest, were pretty much surrounded by the overwhelmingly strong Soviet forces. Hitler didn't allow this part of the German army to withdraw sensibly when they still could. They virtually threw them into the equation as sacrificial forces just to slow down the Russians. Came Christmas, and we had an invitation from the German forces, from the Wehrmacht, to spend the Christmas with them. And this wasn't an invitation we could refuse. And so we went, and I very clearly remember this occasion, because it was very spectacular, but I can't remember what they served for a meal, which is strange. When we arrived, it was a long white table, beautifully set, with little Christmas twigs by the plates, and the Christmas tree at the end of this long room, and a huge swastika flag at the end. And we were seated, one German soldier, one Jewish boy, one soldier, one German soldier, one Jewish boy. Mind you, they didn't know, of course, that we were. As I say, I don't remember what we had for a meal, but I do remember an extremely gloomy atmosphere, because the Germans were inviting us to be reminded of their families, whom they were not going to see again, because either they were going to fall in the ensuing kind of climatic fight around the castle, or they were taken prisoners to the Gulag, which was almost as bad. As I say, I know that about less than 10% of German prisoners returned to Germany from the Far East, from Siberia. So shortly after this Christmas, the fighting started. This was the last stand of the German army, with a few still loyal, misguided Hungarian troops alongside. And they were based on the royal castle, which on top was a beautiful, elaborate palace, but it was on medieval walls and subterranean passages and so on. So that was ideal for their last stand. But I don't think that more than a dozen of them ever survived.
Steve, would you mind making sure that you speak?
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Not many survived. But we had the experience of the front line actually going through us. And we had to relocate several times. First time because the villa, the rather nice building we were stationed in, the villa above us was shot to pieces by the Soviet artillery. Actually, the Russians already have these multiple rocket, so-called Katyushas, or Stalin organs, which were very spectacular to see at night, whooshing off one after the other. The Germans had nothing like that. And anyway, after the fighting, the close fighting, this huge destruction, physical destruction all around, this district was virtually obliterated because of their resistance and because of the overwhelming artillery force of the Russians and the bombardment. They had also complete control of the air. And when we came out, it was just looking round, it was just like Gaza. But it was, the difference was that it was a relatively small area around the royal castle. The rest of Budapest suffered, and there were bombed out buildings here and there, and so on, you know, signs of fighting. There were areas of house-to-house fighting, but not systematic destruction, only around us. And we had to relocate several times because of it. Each time, getting up and going to an unknown, uncertain destination. On one occasion, we went to a school which was converted into a military hospital. Again, it's echoes of Gaza in a way. And we were given a couple of rooms as refugees there. And my aunt, who was in charge, my aunt was in charge of our little group, but we weren't allowed to recognize that she was a relation. My two cousins, her two sons, were part of the group. They weren't allowed to call her mum or the real name. She was called Ergi, and we had to call her Margaret. Anyway, when we were in this hospital for temporary shelter, she overheard some Hungarian nurses talking amongst themselves, saying, we don't believe that these are genuine refugees. No, they look to us like Jewish boys, etc. And when she heard that, we had to get up the following morning and leave again. Interestingly, in some of these relocations, the German troops were actually helping us. There was one occasion when German soldiers were carrying a Jewish boy in her neck at one of our night escapades across back gardens, snowed in back gardens. And we were shot at from the front line. We weren't too far from the front line. And it's interesting how, when you are very young, you take everything as just one of those things. And I remember clearly bullets whistling past my ears as we were being shot at, and not being afraid particularly. Just that must have been a bullet. Yes, interesting. And and I only realized the dangers and the feelings in retrospect, and also as a reflection from how scared and worried the adults around us were. We were besieged during this fighting, and again we had a similar experience, although for a short time, of being cut off all supplies of water, electricity, anything, food. And luckily it was a height of winter and there was a lot of snow, and so we scooped snow and melted snow for water. On one occasion, one of the adults, in trying to do this from the adjacent street, got shot, and actually she died, shot dead, scooping snow. Sorry. And on one occasion, again the German troops helpfully shot a horse to feed the surrounding population, which was wonderful. It was the best meal we had during that period. Horse goulash, very good actually. And but rest of the time it was not so good. So anyway, we went from place to place. On one occasion we were in a church which was in a cave in the rock formation of the Buddha Hills. We spent several nights there, and then we went on eventually we were in a basement shelter area in one building we had no special connection to, and one day suddenly in the doorway above us, because we were deep down and steps up, and in the doorway a Russian soldier appeared. It was a tremendous sight with his great Cossack hat, and looked round, and he was only asking, Nemetsky, Nemetsky. Oh, that's all he was interested in. Were there any Germans around? He said, no. All right then. He turned and went. And soon afterwards, following days, we saw a lot more of the Russian troops. And actually, initially, we were fed by them. I remember a particular shaped bread they were handing out, and soup. So that was in Buda. As you probably know, the Danube divides Budapest. The hilly part is Buda, which is where we were, and the flat part is Pest. Our home was in the Pest part, but right after liberation, we couldn't cross back and check on our home, because all the bridges were blown up by the Germans. Beautiful bridges, actually. So we had to wait for the Russians to build a pontoon bridge. And then we, my mom and I, actually my mom had a job to find us, because I was separated from my mother, who was in charge of a group of girls in a different building. And after liberation, she was trying to find us. And she went to the first address and said, oh yes, they were here, but they were bombed out. I said, maybe try this address where they might have gone to. And then they said, yes, they were here temporarily, but they went on to there. So eventually, she tracked us down. And we got hold of a small cart that we could pull, a little cart on 4 wheels. And we went across the pontoon bridge to see what's left of our flat, and we were going to rescue whatever was left. When we got there, in one glance, we could take in the fact that we were homeless, because the building had its main wall to the street completely down. It was just like a concrete framework. And you could look into our family home on the first floor as if into a doll's house. Some of our furniture was there, and the light fitting hanging from the ceiling. The concrete staircase was still relatively safe to use. So we went up there, and my mom kind of pulled drawers and things, and there was some things still in her drawers, and she could rescue. And we put those things in a little cart, and then she said, well, she got tired. I said, let's go for a coffee. When we came back, the bundle she put together was gone. And this is the only time I saw my mom actually cry. She was so upset losing that little bundle. We were temporarily put up by my uncle, who was a dentist, in their very beautiful flat, where we had a room, and we were waiting for my father's return from Belgium. Because what happened to the Kastner transport he was involved in was that it was never reaching Switzerland. Why? Because this deal that Himmler and Kaltenbrunner and Eichmann made with Kastner was behind Hitler's backs. And when Hitler discovered it, well, he very nearly sacked Himmler. He was furious and stopped the whole thing. So my father was in Belsen and stranded there. But curiously, the Germans kept that transport separate from the main camp. They were treated as hostages as opposed to ordinary inmates, with various privileges. They could keep their own clothes. They weren't tattooed with numbers, and to some extent they could have their own setup. My father was working as a doctor for this group and got a bit of extra rations as a result in payment. And he said, together with that and the occasional Red Cross parcels that were allowed for this group, they were still starving. And eventually they were transferred from there to Theresienstadt. And I don't think that any privilege was extended then to the group. My father was seriously ill in Theresienstadt and very nearly died, but survived, and eventually came back. But we had no news of him until we arrived on the doorstep, which was the summer of 45. In the meantime, we tried to look at lists, survival lists here, there. They were sometimes posted in shop windows. Well, and on one occasion, my mom took me, and we went together to a fortune teller to ask whether my father survived or not. And of course, you always get the answer that yes, everything is fine. So life then restarted after that. But I want to just mention one or two other stories of the Holocaust period, because there are some things that are incredibly painful. The children's home I was in had a range of different ages of kids. And later I read the story of one of the older boys I didn't actually have contact with because he was several years older and age groups kept apart. And his story of how he got there is quite shocking. He was traveling on a tram with his parents. It was a crowded tram. And this was in the period of the takeover of power by the Arrow Cross party and militias. And the Arrow Cross militias were worse than the Nazis. And they were hunting Jews everywhere. And this was a crowded tram, and this boy, this friend, went to the front because the trams are quite basic, and there was no division between the driver and the rest, except a bar across. And you could see the driver operating the levers, which was fascinating for a boy of, he must have been around 10, 11. So he went forward, and his parents were left behind. And then at the next stop, an Arrow Cross militia group got on the tram, and asked for papers all around. And they discovered the parents as being Jews and arrested them straight away. Now, they had an instant decision to make, the parents, whether to say goodbye to their son and thereby endangering him and getting him caught in the net, almost certainly, or do nothing. And they chose the latter. They were taken down at the following stop and transported straight to Auschwitz. my friend eventually discovered that he was on his own. And somehow, through intermediaries, he ended up in his children's homes, where I was also. And he never heard from or seen his parents again. And I think this kind of lethal danger is something else again. And I cannot imagine the pain then and later of the parents who had to leave without saying even goodbye to their young son. There was something similar closer to my family. My aunt Erji, who later was in charge of our little group, earlier on had her niece from the countryside staying with her in her flat. And the time came that she had to go back to the south of Hungary, near the very lovely city of Pécs, close to the Croatian border. And my aunt was taking her, a teenager called Ilonka, to the station to board the train and say goodbye. And they already parted, and Ilonka was about to get on the train when again an Arrow Cross militia stopped her and asked for papers. And I think Jews were already prohibited from using public transport, believe it or not. And she was immediately arrested. My aunt saw all this happening and could not intervene, because again she would be just caught in the same net. And again Ilonka went to Auschwitz, but she came back as a lucky survivor, again probably put to work because she was a young teenager and, like my other cousin, survived. But I remember Auntie Erji coming back from this experience completely broken to pieces, with a traumatic fit. It was terrible. It took some time to recover from. It's interesting to think about the long-term effect of these traumas as well. She eventually, after 1956, ended up joining her sons, or one of her sons, in Sweden. After 56, both my cousins left Hungary, and one of them went to Sweden because he was a metallurgist and was particularly interested in Swedish steel, and he re-qualified at the uni, etc., and did very well. Eventually became a sort of ambassador for Swedish steel on international conferences. Anyway, her mother, this aunt with this traumatic experience, joined him, but was never happy in Sweden. They were very well off, and everything was fine, and eventually committed suicide. She jumped out of a high-level window, and one wonders how much the original traumas played into that. Nobody will know. Sorry. I think I probably said enough to answer questions.
Question number one.
Yeah, okay.
There's a few more questions if you don't mind.